So I think we can get started. So welcome everyone to this Tuesday evening. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome everybody in the audience to this series of Vantage Point, which is a series that is hosted by the Worldwide College of Business. So thank you for your presence here this evening. We've got a wonderful, charming, well-presented guest with us. Dr. Ken Wilcox is here. He joins us from the West Coast himself. So Ken, welcome to the Vantage Point, and thank you for doing this. So just a little bit of an intro about Ken. Ken joins us. He is presently the Emeritus Chairman of Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, as it's lovingly known, and is the author of a book called Leading Through Culture. Previous to his current role, which is Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Wilcox was the CEO, the head honcho of SVB, financial group itself. In that role, he successfully pursued a strategy of expansion and diversification while remaining focused on the group's core niche of technology, life sciences, and venture capital. Mr. Wilcox earned his master's degree in business from Harvard Business School, as well as his PhD in German studies at Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, as they like to call that. Ken, I want to wish you a very, very warm welcome, and I'm excited to have you join us, and we're just raring to listen to you and the wisdom and all of this. And a plug for SVB, which is, if any one of us had invested in SVB last year, it has since tripled since April or March 20th of 2020 to where it is today. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of them, Ken. So that's how it goes. So it's a great institution. SVB is an institution, a stock that I'm familiar with. My son worked there as well. Housekeeping before I hand it over to Ken is to, if you have a question, please put those questions in the chat box. Matthew, that you see on the screen, Rachel, will take care of your questions to ask it on your behalf. So thank you for listening. Ken, the show is yours. I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to hand it over to you, sir. Take it over. And once again, thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. I appreciate this opportunity to speak here tonight. It's very kind of you. I'd like to begin with just a little tiny bit of background because it'll help to explain where I'm coming from and make more sense of what I'm about to talk about tonight, which is innovation and how to encourage innovation in a corporation. So I basically, in my entire life now, have two small claims to fame, 2 days in the sun, so to speak. One of them is that when I became CEO of Silicon Valley Bank in 2001. At that point in time, Silicon Valley Bank was 18 years old. I made a decision which laid the foundation for what's happened at Silicon Valley Bank for the last 20 years. That decision was to dedicate the entire bank to technology and innovation. Prior to 2001, the bank had pursued a strategy that they referred to as the three-legged stool strategy. Basically, they meant by that 1/3 of the bank was going to be technology, 1/3 of the bank was going to be real estate, and 1/3 of the bank was going to be general lending, the kind of thing that every bank does, lending to this corporation and that corporation and this other one, across a broad variety of industries. Well, by the time I became CEO, the third that was technology was down to only 20%. I think because my predecessor wasn't as keen on technology, but was far more interested in real estate based on his own experience. That said, I will tell you that my only interest in banking was in working with innovation-oriented companies, basically venture-backed startups. That was why I was in banking, and that was what I wanted to do. I also felt that all the other things we were doing, real estate and various corporations, that those made us look like every other bank in town. There was nothing unique about them. We had no particular expertise. But in technology, we were almost the only game in town. At the point in time when I became CEO, there were well over 10,000 banks in the US. And we were literally the only one that was focused on technology to the extent that we were. It was what made everybody excited about working there. And it was what we looked forward to when we woke up in the morning. It was what gave us our energy. So my first and most important decision as CEO of Silicon Valley Bank for those 10 years was to dedicate the entire bank to technology. We basically took the other 80% and gracefully encouraged people to go find other places to do their banking for them. And we filled up that empty 80% then with purely technology and venture capitalists. So today, 99% of all the customers that do their banking at Silicon Valley Bank are either technology companies, the vast majority startups, some very large, once upon a time startups, and or venture capital firms, because venture capital firms need banks as well. That was my claim to fame. And my other one, which was even smaller, was one day, I think in 2008, somebody asked me to give a speech at Stanford. When I arrived, they asked me to sign a piece of paper, basically saying it was okay to turn it into a webinar. I wasn't entirely sure what a webinar was because I'd never really done one at that point in time. So I signed it, and lo and behold, my speech appeared on the web and people started referring to it when they met me for the first time. And in that speech, I said one thing that it turns out I didn't invent. I thought I had, but it was invented by Peter Drucker, apparently long before I was even thinking about it. And that is that culture trumps strategy, meaning that culture in a corporation or a company is much more important than strategy. Well, in my entire time at Silicon Valley Bank, which was, it's been now 31 years since I joined Silicon Valley Bank, and that entire time, I did one thing that I'd recommend to almost anybody, and that is I kept a journal. Every night in the evening sometime, I would take out 15, 20 minutes, and I'd write down certain things about my experiences during the day. One of them would be, what were the biggest challenges we were facing? A second one would be, how are we dealing with these challenges? And a third one would be a review of the past several months to the extent that it made sense at that point in time, criticizing or praising, I guess, the decisions we've made up until that point in time. And I found that to be really helpful. It really helped me more than almost anything else I did. That level of reflection, 15, 20 minutes a day on what we'd done and whether or not it worked. Well, when I finished my career with Silicon Valley Bank, or almost finished it, I started looking at that stack of journal entries on my desk, and I realized I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And I felt that there was a lot in there that other people might find useful. So I started writing this book a few years ago. And now, of course, it's been in print for a year now. And I really enjoy getting together with people and talking about the topics in the book. And that's what I'm planning to do today. So what I'd like to do in these few minutes that we have together is I want to spend just a few minutes giving you a basic skeletal outline of what's in my book without going into any detail, so that you have a sense of the backdrop. And then I want to zero in on a specific topic, that being how to encourage innovation in a corporation, in a company. So the book itself focuses on the following topics. It focuses on, first of all, how to be a good leader. My premise is that leaders are not born. They may be born with some predilections, some basic characteristics that are helpful, but leaders learn to be leaders through trial and error, through challenges. And to be totally candid, I'll openly admit, when I found out at the end of 2000 that the board was going to appoint me at the beginning of 2001 to the position of CEO of the bank, where I was for 10 years, I was initially thrilled, as anybody would be, that was getting a big promotion. But I will admit that thrill lasted only a few minutes. After a few minutes of experiencing the thrill, I suddenly was scared to death, largely because I realized I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never been a CEO before. And being the head of a division, which was probably a step prior, doesn't really prepare you for the responsibilities of being a CEO. So I started looking around for examples. I started thinking about other CEOs in our bank prior to me and in other organizations whom I'd observed. After all, I'd been calling on CEOs at that point in time as a banker for years and years and years. But to be totally candid, and at the risk of sounding maybe a little brash, which I don't think I am, I didn't see any great examples. I saw a lot of examples of leaders who were good enough, but in many cases, I felt that they had some real deficiencies. There are things they could have done differently, I thought, that would have enabled them to do a much better job. So I was initially, as I say, scared to death. The next morning, I got up and set to work. I, first of all, got myself a really good management consultant. I started reading books. I started making appointments with CEOs that I knew in order to discuss questions about how to run a company with them. And as I say, I started my journal. So the first part of the book is what I believe to be the characteristics of the best CEOs that I know. Secondly, I have a section in the book on how good CEOs choose their management teams. And then third, I have a large section, it's the preponderance of the book, on how to build a good culture, a culture that results in, first of all, people being happy in their positions, and secondly, people accomplishing a lot for the benefit of their customers and their shareholders. Basically, when I talk about culture in the book, I'm focused in a way on three different characteristics of what I consider to be a productive culture. One of them would be that a culture should encourage, in my opinion, if it's going to be really successful for the benefit of everybody, the employees, the customers, the shareholders, and even the community, a culture should encourage employees to be self-governing. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the opposite of self-governing is basically a culture which has a child parent in relationship inherent to the entire group of employees, meaning that there are some employees at the top who function more like parents bringing up children, and everybody else is relegated to the role of a child and is taking orders from the top. Whereas at Silicon Valley Bank, we focused a lot on helping people to become self-governing, much the way you want your own children to be when they grow up. You don't want to be calling them every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning and reminding them that they've got to make their bed before they go to work. You want them to incorporate these important values. Maybe making your bed isn't one of them, but incorporate the important values of the corporation into their own conscience so that they do the right thing on their own, as opposed to waiting for somebody to catch them doing something they shouldn't and reprimand them. So that would be one aspect. The second more important aspect in the book is that a culture is much, much better if it's more horizontal in its orientation and less vertical in its orientation. And what I mean by that is, in many corporations, in my experience, people spend a lot of time basically kissing up and pushing down. They're trying to make their boss happy all the time, and fundamentally, whether they mean to or not, tormenting the people that report to them. I think it's much more important in a good corporation that people learn how to develop lateral relationships, productive relationships with the people that are working with them side by side. And that's because many, if not most corporations, and certainly banks today, are dealing with extremely complex problems on behalf of their customers. And they're solving things that no single person can solve for the customers. It takes a team. And unless these employees learn how to work effectively with a team, they can't really produce positive results for their customers. And I can tell you, spending all of your time kissing up and pushing down does not contribute to that phenomenon. And the third aspect of culture, which I go into at great depth in this book, has to do with the way people treat each other in the corporation. And my contention is that corporations function best where people learn to behave like adults and to treat each other like adults, because complex problem solving requires adult to adult relationships. And what I find is all too often when groups of people get together in corporations in order to solve problems, instead of all behaving in an adult to adult fashion, there's a tendency for people at one end of the spectrum to become what I call obnoxiously assertive. That is, to try to dominate, try to get their way, typically through intimidation. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are far too many people who are passive aggressive. And these would be people who sit through meetings, and when anybody in a leadership position speaks, they tend to smile and nod and try to make the leader feel as if they're a genius, as opposed to contributing original thoughts that can help the leader come to a wiser decision, a better conclusion. And of course, people that do that aren't really even earning their pay, because we pay people for their contributions, for their intelligence and their experience. And if they're just going to sit there and nod and smile and agree with us, they're not helping. When I became CEO of Silicon Valley Bank in 2001, I resolved to do my best with the help of my team to eliminate the people at the ends of the spectrum, the obnoxiously assertive and the passive aggressive, and to coach them to the middle. And if they couldn't get to the middle, to ask them to go find some place to work where they'd feel more comfortable being the way they are. And I think we were largely successful at the one end with the obnoxiously assertive people, and because they're easy to identify. They're so noisy. You can see them from a distance. At the other end of the spectrum, the passive aggressive people, I'm not so sure we were quite as successful, because it takes a long time to find them. They're hiding, so to speak. And then there's a part in the book that deals with communicating with your constituencies, meaning your employees and your customers and your regulators or government people, or your community. And then finally, in my book, there are two chapters that are more relevant for today. One of them is dealing with change, because leaders are constantly engaged in the effort to change things and make them better, to realize a dream, a future-oriented dream. And the other chapter is leading for innovation. And that's what I want to talk about today. So with that, I'm turning the page, so to speak, and focus now on how to lead for innovation, which I think is a very important topic. Almost every corporation that I talk to these days is most interested in how do we incorporate innovation into our processes so that we can stay relevant, so that we can stay cutting edge, and so that we can leapfrog our competitors. So that's what I'll talk about today. I have 6 or 7 points. I think that these points are not just characteristic of what we attempt to do at Silicon Valley Bank, but I think they're also characteristic of what we see in the vast number of technology companies that our bank works with. The first thing I would say is that it's really important to know what you mean by encouraging innovation. And I say that because I think from my own experience, it's very difficult to train people or teach people to be innovative. Probably the better course of action is to try to hire people who are innovative and then create an atmosphere, a culture, which encourages them to be who they are, the innovative people they are, helps them spread their wings and exercise their innovative tendencies in a way that ends up being beneficial for the corporation and for the customers. It's a question really of creating the right atmosphere. And now there are several things I would say with respect to the right atmosphere. One of them I've already touched on, meaning it's really hard to give people an opportunity to be innovative in an atmosphere that isn't characterized by some of the things I was talking about earlier. It's so important that corporations become horizontal as opposed to vertical, that they become adult to adult as opposed to the people at the one end of the spectrum dominating the people at the other end of the spectrum. And it's so important that they teach managers how to be good listeners and how to model listening behavior, because people follow leaders, they follow their boss. And if their boss is a listener, they learn to be listeners. People subconsciously emulate the people that they report to most of the time. But probably most important is learning how to encourage rather than punish, learning how to encourage people rather than discouraging them. And that's a difficult thing to learn, I think, for most people. First of all, many people have parents who were as discouraging as they were encouraging. And secondly, many of our leaders at all levels of society have acted in a way that suggests that they believe that that punishing and discouraging are as important, if not more important, than encouraging. I was at a antique store a couple of years ago, and I picked up a stack of Saturday Evening Posts from the 70s. Just because I thought it'd be fun to look at them. And I was reading an article about Richard Nixon. And there was a quote in there from Richard Nixon in which he said something to the effect that those people who believe that you can motivate people through encouragement are dead wrong, that fear is the only real way to motivate people to action. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to blast away at Richard Nixon here, but I think that his attitude is indicative of a certain group of a school of leadership. And I think it's actually dead wrong. It's also very important to put structures in place, mechanisms for finding the best ideas, selecting the best of the best, and then executing on them. We found at Silicon Valley Bank that the leadership has no monopoly on the best ideas by any means, nor does middle management. The truth is, the best ideas can pop up almost anywhere in the corporation, at almost any level. So we developed a system that gave people at all levels opportunities to present ideas. And then we put together teams of people who would cull through these ideas and try to figure out which were the best of the best. And then, of course, we had a process in place for taking the best of the best of the best and filling them out and realizing them and turning them into action. I can tell you, though, that that system is fraught with problems and always will be, because of the following. And I'll use an example. In my last year of being CEO, which was about 10 years ago at this point, because after I quit being CEO, the bank rehired me to go to China for several years and start and run a bank there, which we own half of. The Chinese government owns the other half of it. But the last year while I was here CEO of Silicon Valley Bank itself, one of the ideas that percolated up and that we as a group felt was really important was revitalizing our private bank. Now, private bank means if you're a bank that deals with corporations primarily, as we do, there are always going to be some individuals, often CEOs of corporations, who want to do their banking with you. And so you would have what we call a private bank. By private, we mean it deals with individuals as opposed to corporations. And we'd had a private bank in name only, really, for a couple of decades, but it hadn't done that much. And we decided that it would be very important to revitalize that and to build a genuine, viable private bank, which in the last 10 years has transpired. So part of the process is, of course, bringing people together from all of the various departments in the bank and allowing them to contribute their thoughts. Almost every corporation has departments. You've got HR, you've got risk management, you've got sales, you've got operations, and so the list goes on. Those are kind of double-edged swords. On the one hand, it seems logical and beneficial to divide people into various disciplines and allow them to become experts in those disciplines. So you've got your experts in risk management and on and on and on. The problem is that an expert in risk management is likely to see the world only through that lens. An expert at HR is likely to see the world only through that lens. And so it goes. And generally speaking, if you're undertaking a significant project like building a new organization within your larger organization, and in our case, that was what we were doing, building a new private bank within the major corporation, you'll find that these experts can find tons of reasons why it won't work. The HR people have this objection, which would actually stop the entire project in its tracks. The risk management people are particularly problematic in that regard because they can always find reasons why you shouldn't do things, but it goes all the way around the table. And I found that in terms of executing on this project, we really had to, I personally had to step up as the one person who's responsible for all of the various disciplines and draw lines in the sand. Yes, I get your objection, but we're going to do it anyway. We'll do our best to mitigate the issues that you mentioned, but we're going to do it anyway. And in fact, when I was comparing notes with the chief innovation officer at Apple at one point years ago, he told me that this story about Steve Jobs developing the Macintosh is not just legend, that there's a certain foundation and fact to it. And the story there, which you may be already familiar with, but if you're not, it goes like this. The last computer that Apple was producing prior to the Mac was the Lisa. And just about the time our older son was born, which was, I think, 1984, maybe something like that, Apple decided to develop something better than the Lisa, and that ultimately turned out to be the Mac. But Steve Jobs wisely separated the research and development team that was creating the Mac from the rest of the corporation, and wouldn't let people from the rest of the corporation go over and visit the Mac people for fear that they would be discouraging, that they would come up with objections, that they would throw a monkey wrench into the works. And the Mac people apparently, at least so the legend goes, raised a pirate flag on their roof to signal that they were not going to take guff from other people in the corporation. But that's the way it is with large groups of people. The people that are responsible for yesterday are often extremely reluctant to encourage the people who are responsible for tomorrow, probably for fear of becoming irrelevant themselves, at least subconsciously. Another thing that's really important, it's on the psychological front, but it's actually psychology that drives most of us, which is why I think culture is so important, because culture speaks to the heart and strategy, as we know, speaks to the mind. And that is showing a proper level of encouragement to the people that are developing something new for you. I remember very well a situation that I experienced about 30 years ago, where our East Coast office, which I was responsible for at the time, was setting up a brand new office in, I think, Maryland. I say I think because we've gone back and forth across the Potomac a few times, Northern Virginia, Maryland, Northern Virginia. I'd sent a guy named Frank, who was a sort of a protege in a way. He was extremely talented. I sent him to Maryland to check it out and to build some relationships and to advise us on whether or not we needed to go ahead with an office in Maryland or Northern Virginia. And finally, he came back after proper investigation and said, yes, we should do it. And I said, well, Frank, would you mind moving your family from Boston to Maryland and building this for us? And he didn't look that excited. And he kind of went home and came back a couple of days later, and he said, you know, I don't think I really want to. And I was perplexed because I thought this was a big deal. And I liked Frank a lot, and I figured that I was giving him a special opportunity. But when I quizzed him on it, it turned out that I myself wasn't showing sufficient enthusiasm. What I needed to do was say, Frank, this is one of the most important projects that we're undertaking right now. And I think you're the only guy who could really pull it off. I think this is super important. It's a little bit like, had a picture in my office at the time that I bought in Montana somewhere that showed the inside of a teepee with a bunch of, I guess, warriors sitting around watching one warrior get initiated, so to speak. There was some kind of a wise man or medicine man, I don't know what, or a chief, who knows, who was painting war paint on his face and preparing him for battle. And what occurred to me is that, as a metaphor, it's really important to put war paint on people's faces. It's really important to give them a sense of the importance of what they're doing, because everybody has a yearning inside to be involved with something that's really important and will make a big difference. And frankly, if it's not going to make a difference, why send them anyway? So I learned through that experience early on that encouragement is fundamental to motivating people. Not just encouragement, however. I think it's extremely important that we give people encouragement, even in those situations in which whatever we've asked them to do doesn't work out that well. That's something I think is very hard for people, because I think most people, including myself, have a judgmental streak in them. And when we ask somebody to do something, or they ask us if they can do something, and it doesn't work out that well, there's a tendency to criticize, or at least not to offer very much in the way of praise. And I think that's a big mistake, because I think every project that a corporation undertakes or a group of people undertakes is a potential learning experience. And I'd like to give you an example of what I'm referring to. When I became CEO of Silicon Valley Bank in 2001, one of my dreams, which was consistent with the plan to get rid of the 80% of the bank that wasn't involved in innovation and replace it with companies that were involved in innovation. One of my dreams was to create a financial services organization that went beyond banking. In other words, I don't know how many of you remember this, but in the 80s and into the 90s, in the technology community in both Boston and Silicon Valley and in other parts of the United States where innovation centers were developing, there was a group of investment banks that were called the Four Horsemen. Robertson Stephens was one of them. There were three others. And these were diversified financial services organizations that really did a lot to help the technology community be successful. They tended to leave the banking to us, and they were responsible for raising capital and undertaking IPOs and mergers and acquisitions. My thought in 2001 was, why don't we replace those four horsemen? They'd all disappeared. They'd all gotten purchased by big organizations, and the big organizations, for the most part, inadvertently ruined them. So I thought, why don't we create a new horseman that would be a diversified financial services organization? So I identified the capabilities we needed and planned a staging so that we would not try to do everything at once, but we do it individually over a few years. And the first thing we decided we needed was a merger and acquisition capability, because all technology companies either go public or they get purchased by a bigger one. That's true almost 99% of the time. So we looked far and wide, and we finally found a mergers and acquisition oriented bank, investment bank, that we could purchase and integrate into our own bank. Long story short, in about 3 or 4 years, the whole project failed. We identified the acquisition target, we acquired them, and we couldn't bring the cultures together. And the result was that we lost a lot of money. A lot of money. It was my first really big decision as CEO, but I had a fantastic board of directors, And when they, 3 years later, came to the conclusion that this just wasn't going to work, instead of focusing on all the money I'd lost, they focused on what a learning experience this was for us. That even in the act of failing, we had increased the bank's knowledge base by an order of magnitude. And we leapfrogged our way into a much higher level of activities. We wouldn't be who we are today if we hadn't gone through that. And well, first of all, I was grateful, obviously, because I could have gotten impaled by the board for what I did. On the other hand, I also thought that the attitude was exemplary of a group of people on a board of directors who want to encourage innovative thinking. Because if they'd criticized me, let's say that they had criticized me severely, but not quite fired me, I probably never would have undertaken anything again that would have constituted that level of risk. So I think that is a very important aspect of being an innovation-oriented organization. That is turning failure into learning, as opposed to turning failure into shame. Another important thing, I think, if you want to have an innovative corporation, is delegating authority, which many CEOs find very difficult to do. Delegating authority to people within parameters, obviously, but delegating authority to people in a way that enables them to do things that you might not really think are the best things to do as CEO, but you let them make the decisions themselves. I think that is really important. And I was talking just the other day to a friend of mine who is working with a company in China right now. He was telling me that in China, in the office of the second highest level executive in that company is a big plaque which says, "Teamwork is doing exactly what I want you to do." And it was apparently tongue in cheek given to that person by their employees. But I think there are too many people in leadership positions in corporations and elsewhere who firmly believe that they're supposed to be the quote unquote decidinator, that their job is to tell the whole company exactly what to do, and that success is when everybody does exactly what they're told to do. You could do that, and it may make the trains run on time until the trains become antiquated and outmoded, and people are traveling using some other means of transportation. But if you want to be cutting edge, and if you want to encourage innovation, you have to allow people to make decisions within parameters, even if you don't agree with those decisions. Of course, if somebody makes too many wrong decisions, even within parameters over an extended period of time, you can coach them, you can encourage them to go someplace else. But if you don't give them the opportunity to fly with their own wings, you're never going to become innovative, except to the extent that you yourself are in possession of all of the innovative ideas imaginable. And I don't know a single human being who is. It's also extremely important to eliminate red tape and bureaucracy if you're looking for innovation. I remember during the years that I was working in China, we had an IT team that was trying to put in place a new IT backbone for the corporation. They had their own idea about how they should go about this. We had our own idea, we meaning the American participants, about how we should go about doing this. Because we were all schooled in project management, we had a certified project manager from the US come over to Shanghai and direct the project. But it turned out this project manager was, at least from the point of view of the Chinese colleagues, obsessed with detail and obsessed with planning, and basically following rules of project management that he learned here in the US, wanted to plan the whole project out week for week for week for week. months in advance and not do anything until the plan was perfect. The Chinese colleagues, on the other hand, wanted to make a plan for 2 or 3 weeks, stop after 2 or 3 weeks, review what they'd done, and make a new plan for the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm not in a position to judge which is better, but I can tell you that we ended up having to, because the Chinese were in the majority, we had to do it their way and make the plan for 3 weeks and then stop and review where we were and plan the next 3 weeks, and so on and so on and so on. I think if we had stuck to our guns on that, it would have caused the entire project to implode. And at a personal level, I actually thought that their system in this particular instance was working better than what we were intending to do. Too much bureaucracy, too much process stultifies the innovators and discourages them and makes them want to stop. 3 more points here. One of them is there's a phrase in China called sharpening the saw. And it's basically about it's a story about a woodcutter who owned a saw, and he could saw down maybe 3 trees a day. And that went on well for a few months, but then he could only saw down 2. And finally, he could only saw down 1 a day. And somebody finally came to him and said, look, have you ever stopped to think you've got to sharpen the saw? That's why you're not productive. And I think that people who try to work 70 hours a week often accomplish less than people who are working 50 hours a week. In the aggregate, actually, accomplishing less. Sharpening the saw is really, really important. And I'm going to end with 2 more examples. One is there was, I think he's still practicing, a British sports commentator in Beijing who in 2019, I think it was very critical of the China women's soccer team. He said they're not doing well at all, and they never will do well because they're far too regimented. If you regiment people to too great an extent, those who are innovative will not be able to exercise their innovative qualities, and you won't be successful. And my last story is a story about Renaissance Italy. So on February 17th, 1600, an Italian fellow named Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in Rome. He was burned at the stake because he insisted that the world was round. Not long thereafter, Galileo insisted that the earth went around the sun, not the other way around. The papacy was so upset with his conclusion that he was put in house arrest. He died 9 years later in house arrest. And as the legend has it, with his dying breath, he said, "But I'm actually right." So with that, I think we could stop, and I think we've got 10 minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Yes, wonderful, Ken. If you can hear me, just go ahead and confirm. And again, my name is Rachel Vignes, and I'm joining here as a moderator for the questions that have been asked thus far. Fantastic conversation. 2 points. One of our first questions comes in and asks a little bit of preliminary background. So with banking, very similar to public organizations in that they have a high level of accountability to their public, and they often operate in very structured ways. So how do you promote a culture of innovation in organizations where the hierarchy has evolved to reduce that risk that's sometimes associated with innovation, and where the transparency and accountability are needing to be encouraged so that they can thrive? So if you could just address that question.
Okay, Rachel, so you would pose a stumper right away. And I think you know as well as I do that that's an art. It's not a science. It's almost impossible to provide an answer because the answer is based on judgment, and judgment is ill-definable. But you're totally right, especially for organizations that are dealing with life and death matters. If you're dealing with an organization that's producing some kind of medicine, particularly one that's absolutely necessary in the environment in which we operate. So, for example, a vaccine for the COVID, you really don't want your innovators wandering away and making decisions that ultimately are too risky. So on the other hand, if you don't have innovators, you're never going to find a vaccine in the first place. And so it's basically a question of giving them authority. And I mean actual authority, not just saying you can do it as long as I approve it every step of the way. You can give them complete authority so that they will exercise their innovative tendencies and not be discouraged and leave you. But at the same time, you have to have periodic checks and balances. You have to have periodic reviews where people with judgment make decisions about whether or not something can proceed to the next level. And it is really an art. It's not a science. And the obvious problem, or I shouldn't say obvious problem, because I'm not trying to diminish the essence of your question. It's a really good question. But the real problem is, where is the friction point? How do you engage the clutch on this one? Because if you supervise them to too great an extent, the innovation will grind to a halt. And if you don't supervise them adequately, whatever they create is going to kill somebody. And, we've got that problem in a less dramatic fashion across the board in technology. We definitely do. Think about the ways in which artificial intelligence is being used today. And some ways are good, and some ways are out and out dangerous. And it's almost impossible to wind back the clock. And I remember years ago when one of the most famous venture capitalists, I avoid using his name, A, everybody knows it, and B, I don't want to impugn him, but was so excited about the advent of the internet because it was going to enable democracy to flourish everywhere in the world. From today's vantage point, you could argue, depending on your view, that in recent times, it's done almost the opposite. Now, that's not the same as killing people, although in the long run, who knows? I don't think there's an answer to that question. Well, if there is, I'm not smart enough to answer it.
Addressing that is certainly a challenge, absolutely, and we in the aviation and aerospace industry certainly know that all too well when it comes to the level of uncertainty and risk that our organizations take on. Perhaps we can get a bit of a different switch here then. Another question asked here from the audience: how do you address colleagues or subordinates who are consistently resistant to change and/or innovation?
That's an excellent question, and that's one I feel competent to answer. So I don't cop out on everyone. And that is, when we came to the conclusion, I say we, I claim ownership of the conclusion because I was the driving force. But when we came to the conclusion in around 2001, 2002, 2003, it wasn't overnight. It was a series of steps that we were going to eliminate the 80% of the bank that was not involved with innovation. You can imagine not everybody was thrilled. There were a number of people who said, over my dead body. And at that point, I went over to Stanford University because we're headquartered not far from there. And I talked to a very, at the time, famous management consultant that had been involved in some of the major decisions that Intel had taken only a few years earlier. And I told him what the problem is. And I said, you know, what do you think I should do? And he said, you have to give people three choices. One of them is to be fully on board. The second one is to continue objecting in their hearts, but in their actions to be fully on board. And the third one is to go find someplace else to work where you can be happy. And that's what we did. And I think it has worked well, but you cannot win if you've got sabotagers on your team. And people just have to make a choice. It doesn't make them bad people, and it doesn't even make them wrong necessarily. But in life, we have to pick and choose. They have to pick and choose, and we have to pick and choose.
Yeah, great words of advice and wisdom there, most certainly. Speaking of, when we talk about things that are uncertain, there's one question that comes in here related to the pandemic, and perhaps we can close with that topic, and any other questions that have come in, we can certainly address after the fact since we're approaching the top of the hour here. But this one I do want to address, and it's a challenging one, so we'll leave it with that. It asks this question: the pandemic that we currently face, obviously leaders being faced with very much an uncertain environment, what advice do you have for companies or for leaders to navigate and to thrive during these challenging times? Again, you leading SVP during some of the most challenging times in your lead. So just kind of curious your closing thoughts on that.
Well, Rachel, once again, but you really go out of your way to pick tough questions, don't you? This is sadly a highly politicized question, as you know, and I will be divulging at least an aspect of my political being here by answering it the way I'm going to. But again, it fits into the category of picking and choosing. If I were running Silicon Valley Bank today, and I have no idea what my successor is going to do, but he's really smart and he's really good, so I'm pretty confident I could guess, I would insist that nobody goes back to work unless they meet certain requirements, whether it's wearing a mask or whether it's having evidence of vaccination. I would simply insist on it because in my estimation, and again, it's a judgment call, they're protecting the other employees and they have an obligation as members of our greater team to protect not just themselves, but other employees as well. And I could be wrong, but that's what being the leader is all about, is exercising the final judgment at the highest level. We're not a democracy in the corporation. We don't vote. We don't seek consensus because consensus is an illusion. And voting is, if your CEO takes a vote of the management team on everything, you need another CEO, I think. So they have to exercise judgment. Some days they're right and some days they're wrong. I want to conclude actually an answer to your question with something that my chairman, when I was CEO, the chairman of our bank, who was really a great person, a very experienced and very wise person, he told me early on in our 10-year relationship, he said, your only obligation is to listen to me. You don't have to do what I tell you to do. It's your right to make your own decisions. And if you don't, we're going to be very disappointed in you and feel that we really should replace you with somebody who will make decisions. On the other hand, if you make too many bad decisions, you're out of here. And so there you have it. And I thought he was the best chairman imaginable.
Definitely some tough decisions at the top. So with that, again, from my standpoint, again, thank you for joining us tonight, Ken. I'll answer any additional questions offline with you, and we can get back to our audience. I do want to mention there was one question asked really early on, the book that you had referenced a few times through the presentation. It is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, titled Leading Through Culture and available through Amazon. So again, if nothing more, some great insight. I've actually read through a few segments of the book, and much of what Ken spoke through tonight, he goes into great depth and offers stories to align with that. So there's my mini plug for you, Ken. And again, I thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll turn the floor back over to Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, Rachel, and bravo, Ken, bravo. This is most insightful and exciting conversation. Thank you for taking the time. I would probably venture to say that I would also probably disclose some of my meanings if I just simply stated that I agree with several of the points that you made. So it was a wonderful conversation, and we'll definitely read the book. So it is, for our faculty, for the people who are in the audience, for our students, I think it's going to be a wonderful plug. I mean, they can listen to somebody who's as experienced as you, and take some lessons away. It's just, I think the lesson that I've taken away is it's a continuous adjustment. Nothing is ever scripted that you can just follow from A to Z. You have to adapt, you have to change. And I would say, I don't know if you would agree with this, but as a leader, you have to be bold. Sometimes you have to take your risk, because yeah, the chairman could actually show you the exit door, but you can't let that jeopardize and handcuff you, certainly. So I hope you would agree with that, but that's how I look at it. And I think a successful CEO such as you, absolutely turning over the portfolio from real estate to what I know now is the technology. Awesome, great job. And your bank's performance obviously speaks for itself. So Ken, thank you so much. Really, really grateful to you for taking the time. I'm sure the audience enjoyed it, and would love to stay connected with you if that's okay with you.
Thank you very much. I deeply appreciate it. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Of course, Ken, thank you, and I'll reach out to you offline as well to express our gratitude. We'll have a small token of gift to you as well from the university. As we close out, as we end this segment, as we close out this edition of Vantage Point, we encourage everybody to stay tuned for future events. There will be more, about 4 to 5 a year that we do. And you can visit our ERAU Worldwide YouTube channel for this recording of the past events. So until next time, stay well and take care. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.